What does it take to be successful in school? More and more educators are realizing that it's more than just smarts. But when we think of school, we picture kids learning about reading, writing, and arithmetic. They study history and learn the fundamentals of science. Is that enough? I'm not so sure. I want to talk about an often overlooked, almost invisible set of skills. These skills have been studied, and researchers have found that they are good predictors of academic achievement. Without these skills, people have a lower quality of life. We use these skills every single day. Yet, somehow, schools don't offer classes in them. I'm talking about social emotional skills. I'm here today to tell you about an intervention I am designing to foster these skills, and a piece of action research that I just completed on one of its methods. School is an incredibly social place. Social competency allows children to communicate effectively, collaborate, and form relationships with one another. With these skills, students can negotiate this social world. Deficits in these skills, however, might cause a kid to struggle to self-advocate, or ask the right question when they're confused, or build relationships that provide emotional support. Can you imagine what it would be like if asking a friend to play was as hard as, say, learning a foreign language? Our emotions are another big part of our everyday lives. Emotional competency allows children to recognize and shift how they're feeling. It lets kids identify how others might be feeling and understand why they might feel that way. Deficits in emotional skills might cause a kid to have a short fuse or act out of control. They might have trouble regulating their attention and get lost in their feelings. Can you imagine trying to learn to subtract mixed numbers if you were always worried and never felt safe? Most kids develop these skills naturally through trial and error and in a less formal setting than school. When they don't, though, as educators, we have a responsibility to provide support. The good news is, as we better understand these skills, how they are developed, and how important they are, interventions are being designed to foster them in students. Over the last 4 years, I have been designing a small group intervention program called Guild Chronicles that is meant to do just that. Guild Chronicles is a collaborative storytelling game. In essence, the players imagine themselves as heroes in a story. The facilitator of the group acts as the storyteller. They are the primary authors of the action within the game, and in charge of the narrative and themes that the story explores. Through these themes and narrative elements, the storyteller can also create opportunities for their group to practice targeted social emotional skills. Within this story, the kids are the heroes. By asking questions and describing the actions their characters take, the players are able to interact with the story and influence its outcome. The game uses dice to incorporate chance and excitement and is governed by well-defined but flexible rules. One of the most exciting times in a Guild Chronicles story is combat. Like any good fantasy book, heroic battles with dangerous creatures are featured in most Guild Chronicles stories. The rules for combat are especially detailed, and players spend hours creating customized heroes with unique abilities and weapons that allow them to influence the tide of the battle in different ways. When a battle begins, the players must work together to overcome their foes. Combat is an exhilarating time, though, and sometimes impulsivity gets in the way of collaboration. Players take turns moving their pieces and making attacks, but play often gets disrupted when turns get interrupted. To counteract this, I created a tool that rewarded kids when they didn't interrupt each other's turns. I called it the Patience Power Card, and this card was the focus of my study. During play, students that were given the card had it in front of them. At the end of each of their peers' turns, they rotate this card 90 degrees if they did not interrupt. Each time it rotates back to vertical, the student using the card is given a resolve token. They can use this special currency to get bonuses on rolls or even take an extra turn. The card acts as a reminder to practice the skill and provides the students with an easy way to self-monitor their success. It also serves as motivation to put in the effort that's required to become less impulsive. Gameplay in Guild Chronicles creates a naturalistic opportunity to practice this skill in a setting full of excitement, frustration, and fun. This Patience Power Card was the focus of my action research. I wanted to know if the card was helping students limit the impulse to interrupt. The question I sought to answer was, how often do students with and without the tool interrupt each other's turns? To find out, I had to measure interruptions during combat. For the purpose of this study, I defined interruptions as off-topic shoutouts or side conversations. If the same student interrupted the same turn more than once, I only counted the first interruption. As the kids played, I subtly tallied their interruptions and later calculated the students' rates. Before I go into detail on the data that I gathered, I'd like to frame the research by providing an example of what it is like to actually play the game. As you watch, notes about how I would tally the interruptions will appear at the bottom of the screen. Try to pay attention to how many social-emotional skills the kids need to succeed, and where some of their deficits lie. In this combat, 3 students, Mason, Jonah, and Emma, are battling an elemental stone dragon. Each student has their own hero in the game. Mason's is a ranger, a master archer capable of dealing lots of damage. Jonah is playing a healer and is able to restore lost health to his allies. Emma is playing a well-armored defender who focuses on keeping her allies safe from harm. We are joining the action after a few turns have passed. Mason's hero was wounded when the earthen dragon ambushed the group. Mr. Harris, the storyteller, turns to Mason. Okay, Mason, it's your turn. What power do you want to use? Mason looks through his power cards, weighing his choices. He selects one after a few seconds and tells the storyteller, Mr. Harris, I want to use Reckless Assault. While Mason readies his dice, Emma speaks up. Mason? Mason snaps at Emma. What? Emma replies, You're really low on health, and if he attacks you next turn, your defense will be lower and you'll take extra damage. Mason hesitates for a second, and then says, The dragon is low health. I'm just going to shoot him. He rolls his dice but has terrible luck. Mr. Harris narrates the action. Mason, your arrow ricochets off his rocky hide and buries itself deep in the wall next to the beast. You don't do any damage. That's not fair, Mason shouts. It's bad luck, Mason, Mr. Harris replies. Remember how badly I rolled last week? Try to think of your next move while you wait for your turn. Jonah, you're up. As Mason's turn ends, Jonah and Emma both turn their patience power cards 90 degrees, because neither one interrupted. Mason notices and looks at his. Jonah turns to Mason and asks, How much life do you have left? Only 9, just heal me, he replies tersely. Jonah looks a little frustrated and then says, I think we can finish off the dragon this turn, and if we do, you won't need to be healed. I'm just going to use Smite. Mason leans into the table. Jake, no, he's going to knock me out if he attacks, come on! Emma speaks up. I'll use challenge so that he attacks me this turn, Mason. Jonah doesn't have to heal you if he doesn't want to. Jonah moves his piece on the board and gets ready to roll the dice. Under his breath, Mason mutters, It's your fault if I get knocked out. For a second, it looks like Emma is going to respond, but she turns her patience power card instead. Emma may very well have wanted to interrupt, but noticed the impulse and chose not to. Jonah notices and comments excitedly, Hey, you've got enough for an extra turn now, as he rolls. His luck isn't much better than Mason's. Mr. Harris narrates the action again. You blast the dragon with searing light, but mostly miss your mark. You deal 5 damage. Mr. Harris looks to Emma. Okay, Emma, it's your turn. What do you want to do? I'm going to use challenge, she quickly replies. She moves her piece adjacent to the stone dragon. While she is looking for the right dice, Mason turns to Mr. Harris and blurts out, Can I reroll my attack? The dice bounced off my binder. It's not fair. Mr. Harris responds, I want to see what Emma gets on her roll. It's her turn right now. Emma rolls, and Mr. Harris narrates. Emma, you land a solid blow, dealing 9 damage. A huge crack appears in its rocky hide. The dragon has less than 20 life left. Next, it's Mr. Harris's turn. As the storyteller, he controls the actions of the dragon. It's important to note that his goal isn't to defeat the kids. His role is to challenge them, make the game fun, and provide them with opportunities to learn. Here, he hopes to avoid major conflict and rifts forming in the group, and encourage the team to work together. Because Emma has earned an extra turn for her successful use of the tool, she can interrupt Mr. Harris's turn at any time and give any member of her group an extra turn. Mr. Harris decides to apply some pressure. Okay, Emma, the dragon has to attack you this turn, but I have a plan. First, he uses his tail whip power. Mr. Harris rolls the dice, and does 6 damage. But this attack knocks you back 3 squares. He moves into position and uses Fire Breath, which will hit both you and Mason. Jonah interrupts. Oh, come on, I would have healed Mason if I knew he was going to do that. Meanwhile, Mason appears deep in thought. Mr. Harris quickly processes the interaction out loud. Mason, it sounds like Jonah wishes he healed you. He probably feels pretty bad. Jonah, even if Mason gets knocked out, you can still heal him next turn. Out of the blue, Mason raises his hand. Mr. Harris smiles. and asks, "Oh, Mason, did you have an idea?" Mason pauses for a second, apparently choosing his words carefully. "Emma," he begins, "I have an idea. I think you might be able to save us." Mr. Harris motions for Mason to wait. "I think I know what you're thinking. Let's see if Emma wants any advice." After a moment, Emma shouts, "I've got it!" She holds up her patient's power card. "I could give you an extra turn, Mason. Maybe you could finish off the dragon." Mason responds, "Or you could give Jonah a turn and he could heal me before the dragon hits me with his fire breath." At this point, the group comes together and begins to strategize and create a plan collaboratively. No matter what they choose, by working together they will have found a way to overcome the foe and keep each other safe. At the end of the session, Mr. Harris plans to discuss the conflict that occurred, but for now, the action of the game takes precedence. The students have finished their planning and negotiation. "Okay, Mr. Harris," Emma begins, "I want to use my patient's power card to give myself an extra turn. On my turn, I want to use Opening. It lets me move Mason." She moves his piece to safety, well outside the range of the dragon's fire breath. "Then, I want to use Guarding Strike, so I take less damage from his attack." She rolls and gets lucky this time. Mr. Harris narrates, "You harness the power of your patience, and time slows down around you. You make a fake attack which creates an opening for Mason to get to safety. You strike the dragon with your mace, dealing 8 damage. Time accelerates again, and the dragon's fiery breath engulfs you. You take cover behind your shield, but you still suffer 12 damage. "I still have 4 life," Emma proclaims. Play continues to Mason, and soon after, the dragon has been defeated, and the students celebrate their victory. Before we talk about the interruptions to gameplay, let's quickly break down just a few of the social-emotional skills that the kids used in this short example. Each of them had to practice decision-making under stress, and weigh the potential consequences of their actions against potential rewards. Emma tried to give advice to Mason when he seemed to be making an impulsive choice. Mason was flooded with emotion when he rolled badly, and with Mr. Harris's support he was able to self-reflect and practice gauging the size of a problem. Mason tried, with limited success, asking for help from Jonah, and later, with much greater success from Emma. Mason experienced frustration and had an opportunity to practice self-control, and managed to keep his utterance of "it's all your fault" under his breath. Emma also practiced self-control when she made a conscious decision not to engage with Mason, and instead turn her patience card. Each of them was able to practice collaboration and negotiation as they tried to figure out the best person to take an extra turn. Finally, each of them felt successful and had a sense of belonging when they defeated the dragon. This short scenario gave the students a chance to practice all of these skills and more. The facilitator was there to offer feedback or instruction when a child might need it, and to process conflicts that occurred within the group. I hope that this brief demonstration provided a clearer picture of what a Guild Chronicles session might be like, and how students can learn and grow through gameplay. Now that you've seen the game in action, and how I tallied the group's interruptions, let's take a closer look at the results of my research. Remember, I set out to find out if a game could help a child learn to limit their impulse to interrupt. To do that, I kept track of the kids' interruptions during combat. From the tallies I made, I calculated their rates of interruption. Overall, I gathered data on 26 students for an average of 8 sessions per group and over 1,200 total turns. I began by compiling the data into tables, group by group. Here's what one table looked like. When I talk about rates in this study, a rate of 0.00 would mean that during the time in question, the student interrupted none of their peers' turns. A rate of 0.50 would indicate that they interrupted half of their peers' turns. A rate of 1.00 would mean that they interrupted every one of their peers' turns. When I started analyzing the data, it was hard to make much sense of it. Rates were quite variable, and when I looked at one student or small group over time, it was almost impossible to find any patterns. In this graph, created from the data in the previous table, each colored line represents a different student from this group. The y-axis measures their rate of interruption. Here, in week 2, this student interrupts about 38% of his peers' turns. Here, as in all groups, students' rates usually stay below 20%. In order to compare kids' performance with and without the power card, not every participant in my study received a power card. My goal was to measure both groups' change over time and compare their trends. In this particular group, each of the 6 students did receive a power card, and they received it after week 4. Because so many other factors affect the likeliness of a student to interrupt, it can be hard to see the patterns with this narrow of a focus. It's difficult to tell, looking at this graph, if the tool helped any of the students. But if we arrange the data differently, we can get a better picture. For this graph, I found each student's average rate of interruption before and after receiving the power card. The left bar of each pair represents their rate for the first 4 weeks without the power card, and the right bar represents their rate for the last 4 weeks with it. Here, we can quickly see the data suggests that the card was effective for students 1, 2, 3, and 5. Their rate decreased after they got the card. For students 4 and 6, though, the data suggests that the tool did not work. Their rate increased after they got the card. Even with this view, the narrow focus and limited data makes it hard to make generalizations about the tool's efficacy. To get a clearer picture, I took a broader view of the data and made comparisons between all 26 participants. In this visualization, I arranged the data into 2 groups. In red, the kids that never received a power card, and in blue, the kids that did. This allowed me to see how both groups did over time. In the first 3 weeks of the graph, neither group had a power card. The kids that would get it eventually had a higher rate of interruption during this time. This was likely due to the small number of participants that were included in this group at the school counselor's request. They were essentially targeted for the intervention because they struggled with impulsivity. I made significant efforts to make the remainder of the groups as balanced and representative as possible. In this graph, the power card was introduced after the 3rd week. Afterwards, the group with the card had a decreasing trend in their rate of interruption. During the same time, the group that did not receive the card actually had an increasing trend in their rate. When I looked at the trends from the onset of the study to its conclusion, the pattern was even clearer. With this broad perspective, the data suggests that the card was working. Students that were using it were interrupting less than they were before, and the students that weren't using it were actually interrupting more than they had been. The data led me to conclude that the patient's power card was, in fact, working. I returned to my site of study and presented my findings to the participants. They agreed with my findings and further validated my interpretation of the data. So, did the tool help reduce the rate of interruption? Maybe not for every student, but overall, it was a success. What does this mean for the Guild Chronicles program moving forward? I plan to suggest that the Guild Chronicles facilitators make use of this tool, but use it sparingly. Not every student or every group will need this kind of intervention, and it could be a distraction from other goals. If, however, a student or a group struggles with interruptions, it could easily be implemented into gameplay. The efficacy of the Patient's Power Card has also inspired me to create other similar cards based on the same principles of self-monitoring and motivation. Like the Patient's Power Card, these would be targeted interventions for specific skills. I have begun designing a card, for instance, that is meant to help students practice asking questions when they are stuck. This Clarity card would reward them each time they ask a question related to the game. As I move forward with the development of my program, research will continue to be an integral part of my process. I plan to continue the action research cycle and begin testing new cards with data collection methods similar to the ones used in this study. I also hope to organize larger studies that measure more difficult to quantify areas, such as the game's effect on students' measured emotional intelligence, or their ability to generalize the skills they are learning during gameplay to other settings throughout the school day. The process of questioning, gathering data, analyzing it, and acting on my findings has been immeasurably helpful in the development of my program. I plan to continue it long after the program is published. Thank you for watching this presentation. I hope that you have a better understanding of the Guild Chronicles program as a whole, and what a session might look like. If you would like to learn more about the action research presented here, please contact me at guildchronicles@gmail.com, and I would be happy to share the full report. Finally, if you are interested in learning more about the Guild Chronicles program, you can visit my website at andrew.harrisclassroom.org. Thank you.